Welcome to the We're Doing It Wrong podcast, hosted by Joseph Pazar and a production of WDIW Media. A quick programming note, we have a slew of upcoming episodes that I think you'll enjoy with a range of experts from around the field of education. Next week, you'll hear a conversation between myself and two educators, one of whom wrote an open letter to Betsy DeVos that went viral, in which he makes many good points that I think you'll enjoy listening to. They also wrote a new book called Angels and Superheroes. So it was a conversation I really enjoyed. Another conversation I thoroughly enjoyed was the one you'll hear today with Patricia Julianelle. And she is the Director of Program Advancement and Legal Affairs for Schoolhouse Connection. Schoolhouse Connection is the nation's leading expert on the early care and education of children and youth experiencing homelessness. Patricia is an attorney and legal consultant for state and local governments and nonprofit organizations. She has over 20 years of experience defending children's and youth's rights, including advocating for youth in the education, juvenile justice, child welfare, and immigration systems. Patricia is an expert on education law and policy, including the rights of children experiencing homelessness, students with disabilities, and undocumented immigrants. She has also worked with the National Association for the Education of Homeless Children and Youth, the National Law Center on Homelessness and Poverty, the National Disabilities Rights Network, Washington State's Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction, and the American Bar Association, among others. She's a graduate of Yale and then attended Lewis and Clark Law School. She's taught high school in the United States and law school in Chile, and it was a privilege to have her on the podcast. Without further ado, I bring you Patricia Julianelle. Hi, Patricia. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Sure, my pleasure.
So we reached out to speak with you really because you're a leading expert in the rights of children when it comes to being homeless and how that impacts systems of public education. So what obligations do school districts have for kids who are homeless? And then we also wanted to pick your brain a bit on what's going on right now at the border. But before we launch into that, I'd love for our listeners just to get to know you a bit. Could you give us the Reader's Digest version of how you came to be where you are now?
Sure. Well, I've been doing children's rights law and really kind of particularly education law for probably about 25 years now. I started representing individual children in special education cases, and I had a client once who lost his housing. He was a little 3-year-old boy with autism, and I was representing him and his mom in a special education case, and they were evicted from their apartment over the course of the case. And so I saw firsthand the trauma that caused him, that it caused his mother. They didn't have any money for storage to put their items into storage, so they lost a lot of things that when the eviction happened. And of course, the law enforcement just kind of threw their stuff out of the apartment onto the street. And just watching this little boy with disability deal with that, they also set his dog loose. His dog was in the house, and they just opened the door, and his dog ran away. So you can imagine for a 3-year-old boy, the kind of really stability that dog represented to him, and then he was gone. So a few years later, I continued doing that work, but I really realized at that moment, I think, that I wanted to do work that was more systemic in nature, and the issue of homelessness and the instability that caused really kind of caught me at that moment. And so fast forward, and I've been working on issues really focusing on homelessness for about 15 years or so, and just last year started with Schoolhouse Connection, where I'm very, very, very happy to be.
Yeah, and before we leave today, I definitely want to hear about Schoolhouse Connection, get more details on the work you guys are doing there. I wonder, before we launch into this topic of homelessness and how it impacts students, if I just can't help but relate what's currently happening at the border, the politicization of that issue, and we essentially have this system now where parents, as far as I understand, are being forcibly separated from their children at the border, and the children are being put into our system, often housed in large facilities and then put into the foster care system as the parents are processed as illegal immigrants. And just kind of as a layperson who doesn't, know too much about this, from what I gather from the news, this system of caring for children who come to the border as maybe unaccompanied minors has been in place for years. And so there's probably very good people working in that system. And I know sometimes in our current environment, people are tempted to maybe overreact. So I know as I'm seeing things on social media, I'm going, everybody who's involved in this must be somehow evil. And then I have to take a step back and go, no, there's likely extremely good, well-intentioned people who have been working in this system to help kids who come across the border for years. And so this new addition is actually a policy that basically separates 100% of parents from their children when they cross illegally. And I'm wondering if that's a more accurate picture of what's occurring and what your thoughts are on that issue.
I think it is pretty accurate the way you described it. I mean, it certainly has been going on for many, many years, and people who've been following this in the news for years will remember the sort of unaccompanied minor crisis back in 2013, 2014, when record numbers of youth were crossing the border from Mexico, but they were predominantly beginning their journeys in Honduras, El Salvador, and Nicaragua, and making their way up through Mexico, escaping drug violence, escaping a lot of sexualized violence. So a lot of young women and girls were coming. And, since then and even before then, as you said, there has been a system in place where if those youth are apprehended, they're put into the custody of what's called the Office of Refugee Resettlement, ORR. So even though technically they're not legally refugees, it's ORR that takes care of them. And actually a lot of children, both those who come to the U.S. unaccompanied, as well as those who are now being separated from their parents, are not placed in what we would consider to be foster care, but they're placed with a sponsor or some kind of adult who's already in the U.S., who the child identifies, or maybe their parent identifies as someone that child can live with. And those placements are actually a lot scarier than what would be a foster care placement, because a lot of times, a child might say, oh yeah, that's my Tio Juan, and I'm going to go live with Tio Juan, but it turns out that Tio Juan is actually a trafficker, and this child's family owes Tio Juan a bunch of money, and so now this child's going to go live with him and work, and then sell magazines or clean houses or do whatever needs to be done. And there's no real follow-up for those children. So the ones who are placed with a foster family, there's follow-up, there's someone watching over them, trying to see how's everything going with the foster family. And so those arrangements, even though it's a stranger, at least there's some follow-up and some monitoring of how that child is. So a lot of times, when the children are placed with those sponsors, who we don't always know who those sponsors are. Sometimes they're legitimate relatives and they're good living situations and there's nothing to worry about. But a lot of times they're not, and no system is following them. So the system that ends up seeing them is the school system, because as I'm sure children in the U.S., whether they're documented or not, have the right to go to school.
Right.
So that's usually the only public system that's really kind of seeing the aftermath of what happens to these children after they're released into the community, and they're really not being followed very closely by anyone.
Wow. So is the new, I guess the addition here is the fact you probably have younger children, because I'm assuming under that system, the children are crossing under their own volition, so they're older, and you have children in the past who basically come to the border knowing maybe a bit about what's going to occur, whereas now you've got a high percentage of kids who are maybe surprised to be removed from their parents and very young. Is that the new part here to the story?
I think the new part is partly the age, certainly the trauma of being separated from your parents in that unexpected way. I mean, certainly if you're a 13-year-old girl and you're setting off on your own to cross Mexico to get to the United States, that's very traumatic. And the children commonly have really horrible things happen to them on their journeys. But at least that's something that, you sit down with your mom and or your dad and you talk about it and you make a plan, rather than arriving and having it happen very unexpectedly and the trauma that causes. Word travels fast, and so I'm not sure that it's a surprise anymore for people who are coming now. But I think they're coming from such desperate situations that even for a parent to think, well, this still might be the best hope for my child. This still might be the best way to ensure that they're not, murdered walking down the street or forced to join a drug gang. And so even though this is going to be horrible and traumatic, it's still kind of the best option we have.
You mentioned basically any child in the United States, regardless of, immigration status, citizenship status, is entitled to access to public education. So how do you know how that logistically is working for the large facilities on the border where you've got, hundreds of children living in kind of one large space? Are they regularly getting access to public education once they're detained?
Well, I should say that I don't have any current information about what's happening now to the children who are being separated from their parents.
Mm-hmm.
I can tell you that, over the time that youth have been coming in unaccompanied, et cetera, usually when they're in a facility, they're not going to school because there are other things that are happening in that facility, which is primarily they're getting different kinds of health screening, and ORR is looking for where they're going to put those children long term. So they usually actually enroll in school once they leave the facility, and they go again with a sponsor, or they go into some kind of a foster type of arrangement. So I don't know right now if the children are actually, somehow being bused from these facilities to some local public school. That's outside of my knowledge. I don't think that's happening, but I don't know.
Yeah, it'd be something interesting to watch to see how, I can imagine if they're, my understanding is there's, as we talked about, a system that's been in place and that's probably now seen an increase in numbers because of the addition of forcibly separated children. So I do wonder if that system is going to end up overwhelmed and how long kids are going to be waiting before they get, placed in homes and access to education. So it's definitely a concern, I think. But shifting to this idea of homelessness, I don't think there's a public school teacher in this country that doesn't have experience teaching students who are experiencing homelessness, unless, of course, they're brand new to the profession. And so as a teacher myself, it's, you see the effects in the classroom. It's often, I have one anecdotal case, or several, but one I think of often where it came as a complete surprise to me, because obviously we're not, kept well informed always, because the parents and the student even, maybe they don't want to share information now that they've lost their home and that they're couch surfing. And so I had one student in particular who was really just phenomenal, just really knew how to work hard, was extremely bright. And then all of a sudden, everything changed. Nothing was getting done. There was no instance of poor behavior, but it was just as though the ability to think and to do the math, because I'm a math teacher, had suddenly vanished. So we were talking, I just brought up the homework. It's like, hey, why aren't you doing any work anymore? What's going on? And she said, well, it's difficult to find a quiet space because they're really changing locations, every few days. And that's when it struck me that, okay, this kid their family just lost their home, and now they're really unstable in terms of where they're living, and there's no way that I'm ever going to assign this kid, at least until the situation changes, homework again, because it's just putting her in this terrible situation. And I think about all the other teachers across the country who come across students who are homeless, and the questions that we face as practicing educators: what kind of changes should we make in the classroom for our students? If we do X, does it actually cause Y? Is it, when we try to help, do we actually cause more harm? If I reduce requirements on this student in the classroom, is that a reduction of expectation and rigor? So we have all these sort of large standing questions, but before we dive maybe into the ground level for teachers, I wonder if the root causes of homelessness, they probably appear pretty simple and straightforward to most of us: poverty. But if there's more to it than that, and if just thinking, well, people become homeless because they're poor, if that's maybe harmful in its simplicity. So why are people becoming homeless in the United States? What are the root causes outside of maybe just not making enough money?
Yeah, well, for family homelessness, certainly the economics are a huge part. Not only is being poor and not making enough money, but it's also the increase in cost of housing, and particularly since the 2007 crisis. A lot of former homeowners have now moved into the rental market. So you've got more renters out there than you ever have had before. And then you also had a concentration of property into fewer hands. So you have, to a certain extent, fewer landlords or fewer rental units available. So, definitely the difference between income and what it costs to maintain housing is a huge factor. But there are also a lot of other contributing factors as well. So domestic violence is a significant contributing factor. Substance abuse can be a contributing factor. Those are probably the biggest ones. Mental illness as well, that can, express itself in substance abuse or domestic violence as well.
And so has there been a stark increase with the opioid crisis as of the last few years with homelessness?
I wouldn't say the opioid crisis has caused a stark increase, no. I mean, it factors into the equation, but, before there were opioids, there were lots of other substances that people abused. So I don't think the opioid crisis is responsible for any kind of a significant increase. Mm-hmm. It probably is in certain communities, but I don't think that that's a kind of a direct cause and effect.
And so what is your work in relation to this issue? Are you advising school districts and local governments, or how do you contribute to sort of the on-the-ground work to help students who are homeless?
Yeah, we do that in a few different ways at Schoolhouse Connection. So we do work directly with a lot of school districts and state departments of education. We provide them with information about the pertinent laws, and we try to help them implement those laws. We do a lot of listening as well to people at school districts and at state departments of education to hear what their struggles are and what the barriers are that they're facing. And then we can take that through our policy work to state legislatures as well as to the U.S. Congress. So we do quite a bit of policy work as well. And we also have programmatic interventions that we can help in different stages of education, I'd say. So we have an early childhood initiatives program where we're really working to increase access to Head Start, pre-K, early intervention, and other early childhood programs for young children and young families experiencing homelessness. We have a higher ed program where we're trying to increase connections and graduation from post-secondary programs. And then we also have a youth leadership program where we're working directly with about 100 young people who are at different stages of their education, everything from last year of high school all the way up through graduate school and into the workforce. And we provide them with different kinds of support and mentorship through their journeys as well.
So it sounds like it's a full court press. There, no stone is left unturned. Yeah. And I'm curious about the policy side. So maybe the work with politicians and governments, local and federal and state. Does that work? Do you guys engage in research on things such as, local housing markets and the amount of houses that should be built or units that should be built and the percentage of low-income housing that's needed? Or do you basically, are local governments doing a good job of managing that kind of issue? And how involved do you get in with those sorts of statistics and data?
We don't really work on housing policy per se. Our realm is really homelessness and homeless assistance. Mm-hmm. So we certainly support, more affordable housing and increases in access to affordable housing, but that's not really within our policy work.
Yeah, I know in my local city, I think the median house price just exceeded $400,000. And while that may not seem ridiculous to people living in certain large cities where it's much higher, it's just amazing to me to see the change over the last few years. I think that number was in the 200s, somewhere in the 200s, just a few years ago. And obviously people are getting priced out, and the number of low-income housing is it's just not keeping up. And so when homelessness, when this disaster, because I can't think of a better word. It really is a disaster probably for a family and a child, particularly from the viewpoint of being a student, strikes and all of a sudden they're thrown into this chaos of not having a stable home. What is it that the very basics, maybe just like the McKinney-Vento Act. What are the things that school districts at the very basic level need to ensure that they have in place for any family that strikes this sort of disaster?
Well, the first thing, every school district, and that would include charter schools as well, is required to designate a homeless liaison or a McKinney-Vento liaison. And that person really needs to be out there in the school district, in the community, doing education and helping people to understand that there are homeless students. So for me, it's really heartening to hear you as a teacher know that you know about the McKinney-Vento Act and that you know that you've had students experiencing homelessness, because a lot of teachers don't know that simply because no one's ever told them. And so they're not aware, they might not even be aware that there are homeless children in their classroom, particularly, in suburban areas or in rural areas. Even though research shows that the prevalence of homelessness is statistically identical in rural areas as it is in urban areas.
Oh, really?
It's just harder to see. So, it's great to know that in your area, I happen to know the liaison in Washoe County Public Schools, and it seems like she's doing a great job of getting the word out and helping people to know that there are homeless students and that there are rules to help protect them. So, you asked for kind of a quick summary of those. I think that one of the most important ones is the ability to stay in the same school, even though homelessness forces students to move around. So in the anecdote that you gave, that young girl might have been moving. It's different in Nevada since you have county school systems, but in other places where the school districts are smaller, it's very common for children to cross district lines, multiple times in a week. They might be out of the attendance zone, they might be out of the school district where they would normally be expected to change schools. But those moves are only due to their homelessness. And so McKinney-Vento allows the children to stay in the same school despite those moves so that they can have at least the school stability in their lives, even though they don't have any stability at home.
And then the impetus is on the school district to provide that transportation free of cost, obviously. And my understanding, and actually, before we go on, you brought up a good point. Maybe give us just a quick overview of the McKinney-Vento Act for the listeners who aren't familiar with it. It's federal legislation, and what are the teeth in that legislation? What prompts school districts to comply and states to comply? And is it just the power of the purse, or are there other requirements that just have to be accomplished by law, or is it simply one of these things where if you don't do it, you don't get certain funds?
Well, McKinney-Vento is a federal law, as you mentioned. It was originally passed in 1987, so it's been around for a while. As I said, it allows students experiencing homelessness to stay in the same school, even if they're moving around. It also requires them to be enrolled in a new school. If they are moving so far away that they can't stay in the same school, they're allowed to enroll immediately without the paperwork that normally would be required. Because again, you can imagine if you're fleeing an abusive situation at 2 o'clock in the morning, you might not be grabbing the immunization records, and you don't have a utility bill, and you don't have the school records. So it allows those children to be enrolled in school immediately, and then the school and the family can work together to get those records or regenerate them over time. It is a federal law that does come with some funding that goes to states, and then states give out that funding through a competitive subgrant process to school districts. About 10% of school districts across the country actually get McKinney-Vento funding, but there's also through the Title I Part A statute, which many more school districts get Title I funding. There's some special set-asides in Title I to support students experiencing homelessness. So, talking about the power of the purse, really the only way that the federal government has to influence educational policy is through money. Constitutionally, education is given to the states, and so the only way that the federal government has the authority to regulate education is through money. So that's why, federal education policy comes with dollars attached. There's no other way really to do that legally. So I'm not aware in the history of the McKinney-Vento program, as far as I know, there has never been federal money withheld, but there have been lawsuits brought on behalf of children and families against school districts that weren't complying. And every lawsuit that I'm aware of, the family and the students prevailed in that lawsuit.
Oh, interesting. And I can imagine it becomes a huge logistical challenge for large school districts busing wise, but such an important thing to plan for and be ready for, because as kind of we've been discussing, having some form of stability in that situation on the public education side is vital. I wonder if you have a sense of whether or not, or let me take a step back. How do you measure progress in your work? Is it, because it sounds to me like you're advocating for students once they are experiencing homelessness. You're also obviously interested in the causes and reducing homelessness. But how do you measure success? How does Schoolhouse Connection measure progress? What should we be looking for to go, what, we're actually moving the needle on this issue?
Well, at Schoolhouse Connection right now, we're involved in a national campaign called Education Leads Home. And that's a campaign we're doing together with 3 other national organizations. And we have 3 goals in that campaign that look at early childhood education, they look at high school graduation, and post-secondary attainment. So we're really measuring our success by looking at how many children experiencing homelessness are able to access quality early childhood programs, how many are graduating from high school, and how many are attaining a post-secondary degree, whether that be a college degree or some kind of a technical education degree. And the reason that we consider those metrics to be critical for success is because if you look at the research on kind of factors associated with homelessness, we talked about income and we talked about housing. Of course, what drives income is education. Any research that you look at around the effects of, first of all, graduating from high school, and then second of all, going on to post-secondary education shows the increases in income, the increases in home ownership, the increases in health and well-being that go along with additional education. But even more direct than that, there's recent research that shows that the number 1 risk factor for young adult homelessness, so that would be youth between 18 and 25 experiencing homelessness, the top risk factor is lack of a high school diploma or GED. That's a higher risk factor than anything else that they studied. And it was a very large national study run out of Chapin Hall in Chicago. So we believe, based on that research and based on our experience, that education is the way to overcome homelessness. If we can get youth a good education, they don't have to worry about experiencing homelessness with their young children. And then those children, again, won't have to grow up with that kind of instability, putting them at risk of homelessness later in life.
So it's interesting that the focus isn't on what might be most obvious to, if I was to just go to the street and start asking people, how would you measure progress on the issue of homelessness? They would say, well, we have less homeless folks. But you're actually measuring the outcomes for students who are experiencing homelessness. And then, through that, you're hoping to see a reduction in homelessness. And I see a parallel there with the work we do in the classroom, because, our standardized tests often measure how much can a student show he or she has learned in a given subject area, when really what we want to measure for any given student is how actively engaged that student is in the context of the classroom. And it just so happens that when a student's actively engaged, acquisition of knowledge and the ability to think through stuff is correlated with that. So I see a parallel there with the work you guys are doing. You're focusing on getting students who are experiencing homelessness the highest possible quality education, access to that, and then hopefully over time that leads to a reduction. Because I can imagine that it's obviously a cycle. You mentioned the 18 to 25-year-olds. There's going to be a lot of folks who have children during those years, and if they lack a high school diploma or GED and do experience homelessness, that's another child, if they have one, going through the same thing. So it could be in effect a cycle ender there with educational attainment. And so moving on from the point of progress, I wonder if you have a sense of how we as the United States measure up to really the rest of the world that we would be comfortable making comparisons to. So other large, democracies that have successful economies. Do you have a sense of whether we have a unique problem in the United States, or is this maybe not as uniquely bad as some might think?
I don't really have enough data on other countries, I think, to make a very good comparison about the scope of the problem or the efficacy of their responses. I can say that in the U.S. over the past 10 years, actually longer, probably more like 15, even 20 years, the federal government and the Department of Housing and Urban Development has really focused their financial investment and also their kind of innovation and research on single homeless adults to the detriment of children and youth experiencing homelessness. And that doesn't seem to be a very effective response, because if you're not looking at the younger generations and looking at prevention of people who may become those single homeless adults, then you're just going to have a continuous flow of individuals into homelessness as adults. So, and we've seen that happening. We've seen cutting services to children and families. We've seen programs closing. We've seen child and youth homelessness increase. And, you know, that was kind of an interesting point that you were making about the different long-term versus short-term outcomes. And, you know, of course, we all want to see homelessness go away. I absolutely want to see no more children and youth ever experiencing homelessness, but that can become a very tricky metric, because you get institutions like HUD that kind of define away the problem. So they just stop calling people homeless. They say, well, if you live in that situation, you're not homeless. And if you live in that situation, you're not homeless. And if we have enough beds in a community to house the people who are homeless, we're going to go ahead and say we ended homelessness in that community, even though you can walk down the street and see people experiencing homelessness. So it gets to be something that can become tricky and can become dishonest. Whereas in my work, if I see, you know, that your school district in Reno has identified more students experiencing homelessness, my feelings about that are ambivalent, because on the one hand, I don't want more children and youth to be experiencing homelessness. But on the other hand, I want to celebrate the fact that your schools are doing such a good job of identifying the students and supporting them. If all of a sudden you came back next year and had half as many students experiencing homelessness, I would think, why aren't they counting those children? Because I wouldn't just say, oh, fantastic, they cut homelessness in half in Reno, good for them. I would be a little bit more skeptical about that.
Right, yeah, that's a good point. And maybe bringing this back to the local school, I guess I'll draw upon some maybe basic learning I got through my training in education. And that's kind of, it was set up as this dichotomy between sympathy and empathy. And a lot of teachers, and I think rightfully so, are taught to avoid sympathy because it often leads to, a lowering of expectations. You mean well often as a teacher, but you actually do more harm because you feel bad for a student situation, as opposed to empathy that comes from a position maybe of more strength, where you recognize a problem, want to be pragmatic about solving it, but also maintain the highest possible expectations. So you attempt to put yourself in the perspective of the student and the family maybe experiencing something you haven't, and then you ask, okay, how can we achieve similar outcomes, similar expectations? What different changes can I tweak and make to my curriculum to get the student to the same point I would have wanted that student prior to, this, again, I can't think of a better word, disaster occurring in that student's life, as opposed to sympathy, where you go, oh, poor you, I'm sorry you're homeless, I'm going to let you off the hook for certain things. So I'm wondering if you have any advice for teachers on how to balance that spectrum of kind of reading the situation and maintaining high expectations while remaining caring and sympathetic towards the situation.
Yeah, I think the place to start is always with talking to the student and asking them, what's going on with you? What can I do to try to make this situation something that can be less harmful to you, but that also will allow you to keep advancing in your education? Most of the youth that we work with, all of the youth that we work with, really value their education, and they understand that education is kind of their ticket out of homelessness in the future. And so they really want to keep striving academically. They really want to get through school. But, at different times, they might have challenges that are just insurmountable, and that might cause them to leave school, or might cause them, like in your example, to just not do as well as they had been doing. So I always think the first thing is to just ask them, do you need a break on this assignment? I can give you a break on this one. I can't give you a break on all of them, but if you're going through, something extremely traumatic this week, let's take a break. And then let's think about what are you going to need to be able to get back on track with your assignments. A lot of times it's just some changes. So, if you have assignments that have to be done on the internet and you have a student telling you, I don't have a computer, I don't have data on my phone, and there's no internet in the place where I'm staying, and I don't have transportation to get to the library. Okay, so then how can we maybe adapt that assignment? So you're still doing something important and something that we can measure academically, but we're going to overcome this barrier of you not having internet access. Or, I can't build a volcano because I don't have $50 to go to Target and buy the supplies I need to build a volcano. So, okay, what can you do? Let's write a report about volcanoes. Or, I'm not a teacher. I don't have all of the great assignment ideas, but just different accommodations to recognize what the child's really going through.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. It's, you don't take the easy way out. You problem solve, and that's sort of the mindset that I would claim is pervasive among educators. But I also know that teachers, and this varies, of course, by location and the amount of need, can easily become overwhelmed. When you've got 30 to 40 kids in one room and you have multiple kids, who need different things, it becomes a challenge, but it's absolutely the best possible work we could engage in. Again, rather than taking that easy way out and just kind of letting that disaster, just kind of letting it impact the educational experience and not trying to change things up and provide some kind of accommodation, informally or formally. We have obviously several mechanisms whereby we can formalize accommodations. And so I'm really interested here in what kind of work you do with school boards directly. Or do you focus mostly on local governments, or do you consult for school boards as well?
We work with school districts and state departments of education, primarily providing training, again, like I said, training on what the law requires, training on best practices for implementing it. We don't do a lot of direct work at the classroom level. As I said, I'm not a teacher, and I certainly wouldn't presume to be able to tell a teacher how to do her job or his job in a classroom. So we're more working with the school district level administrators. Since we have the ability to go out into local communities and listen, we can be repositories of knowledge. So I can, I know about the great work that Katie Morales in Washoe County is doing with her data and using data to kind of identify early warning signs of potential homelessness. And so I can take that, and when I go do a training in Washington State or in Montana or Texas, I can use that as an example. So we can kind of spread that knowledge and those best practices around the country. So that's primarily what we do. We do try to produce tools and documents that people need, and those, again, are really in response to what we hear. So someone says to me, Patricia, everything that's going on with the immigration system is really confusing. We don't know what to tell our parents and our students. Can you put together a 2-page document on that for us? And so I'll say, okay, and go back to my office and put together a 2-page document. So we really try to be responsive to what people in the field need and what they're asking for.
I wonder, for the average teacher and perhaps non-teacher, just basic citizen from whatever area of the community and economy, if the person's vastly concerned and feels motivated to contribute to the academic success of children experiencing homelessness, what kind of outlets would you suggest to them? Is there a place they should be donating to? Is there some kind of organization they should join? Obviously, the Schoolhouse Connection. How can they contribute to support the efforts?
Well, certainly you can, in your own local school district, contact your school district homeless liaison or McKinney-Vento liaison. They are always looking for donations of, everything from, socks and underwear to the special steel-toed boots that someone needs to do a welding internship that they're trying to do. So they're always looking for a wide variety of items to help support students in whatever their educational needs are. as well as, simple things like food. A lot of these students, the only food they get is their school lunch or their school breakfast. So a lot of schools will prepare food bags for youth to take home over the weekend because otherwise they might not eat over the weekend. So certainly your local school district, McKinney-Vento Homeless Liaison would be someone to get in contact with. If you have homeless shelters or street outreach programs in your community that you can get in touch with. I think for all the youth that we work with, if we ask them, how did you get through school? How did you do this with everything that was going on with your homelessness and the trauma and the violence? In addition to just their own resilience and their own hard work, it's usually one person. It's usually one person who was a mentor, who cared about them, who respected them, who, like you said, didn't lower their expectations of them, but met them where they were and said, how can I help you meet my expectations, rather than how can I just lower my expectations? And so it's great when that person can be a teacher or a librarian or a school resource officer or a bus driver, but it also can just be a community member who goes to the local shelter and says, hey, I'd like to volunteer. How can I help, or how can I be involved? And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that you can donate to Schoolhouse Connection too. We have our youth program, like I said, where we're working with about 100 youth who we're hoping to see successfully through their education and into the workforce.
Yeah, thank you for that information. The one thing that keeps coming to me from our conversation here is, I don't know if you can do better than having high quality, meaningful connections with all of our students, especially those who experience homelessness or any kind of large trauma, or again, some destabilizing chaos that occurs in their life. And it's interesting you mentioned resilience, because often school districts will have this warning system. So they might classify a student as low risk, moderate risk, or high risk for different particular outcomes, maybe graduation, maybe just in general. And that could be predicated on attendance concerns, academic achievement, and standardized tests, suspensions, all sorts of different things that they put into this predictive system. And rather than studying, so then from there, a district might take, for example, their group of high-risk students and look at that graduation rate. And, undoubtedly it's going to be lower than the other groups based on basically the definition of what being classified maybe as a high-risk student entails. And you look at the graduation rate, and rather than focusing and studying, or focusing all your efforts and all your studying efforts on those kids who didn't graduate, really looking at how did those kids who did graduate manage that in spite of all of the challenges that they faced. And I have often thought in my own practice that probably boils down to one word: resilience. And how does one promote resilience in students, in all students, but especially those who have extra challenges? And I think you hit the nail on the head. It comes down to the basics that we all know, but often neglect or find hard to follow through on because we get overwhelmed. And that's that high quality, relationship, that mentor relationship. And I wonder if you found if that sort of relationship is formalized into some kind of mentorship program, if you have better outcomes, or if maybe the students you talked to who were successful, that one person they mentioned, was that often just kind of informal? So like you said, just a teacher or some person at the school. It wasn't necessarily through some kind of top-down program to connect kids to a certain person.
Yeah, I think it's usually informal. I think one of the characteristics of resilience is being able to kind of identify the right people who can be those positive connections in your life and to kind of hone in on them. And so, a lot of the young people that we work with, they find someone often in their school, very, very often in their school, more often than not. But again, it's just someone that they find that they click with for whatever reason it might be. Because it's natural and because it's something that both parties really feel, they have a feeling about it. It's not just, oh, this is my volunteer work, I'm a big sister and I'm going to take these kids to a baseball game or whatever, but it's actually a real choosing. I choose you and you choose me. and we're going to be together and we're going to support each other. And it's something that is in place over time too. A lot of, mentorship programs, they might say, oh, we need you to commit for a year, but for a lot of these really organic relationships, they go on for lifetimes. A lot of the young people I work with now, I work with a young woman who's 25 in Texas, and I met her when she was in 10th grade, and we just picked each other, and we'll be together and we'll be friends for our lives, I'm quite certain. So it's, I think it's more than just, being there for someone to do fun things. It's really about being there for someone to listen to them, to learn from them, to try to help them however you can in different ways, and to be there over time.
Absolutely. Yeah, I wonder if you would agree, if I was to try to boil down, for educators, because I can imagine that many of our listeners are practicing teachers, what to take away is, number one, be aware of the issue of homelessness in your local community. Become familiar with who the liaison for the district is and the systems that are in place. And then maybe even more importantly, take that high expectation, empathetic route when confronted with that challenge in the classroom, and then maintain and seek out those authentic connections with students. And again, I look at, and sometimes I shy away from these simplistic measures, but you look at maybe the demographic makeup of teachers and the demographic makeup of students, and they're just, you can't deny the stark differences. So then you have to ask yourself, how are you as a teacher, and how are we as a staff, if we're a school administrator, actively working to make connections with all of our students, even though we're faced with this, and I would call it an increased challenge, where the cultural background, the life experience, and the makeup of the staff is often completely disconnected from the student body. We have teachers driving from one end of town into a school where almost no teacher who works at that school lives in that neighborhood. And this is pretty pervasive across the country. So I think it takes a special attention to making those connections. I wonder if you would agree with that. I called this a summary, but I ended up talking quite long, so I can't call a summary now. But I'm wondering if you would agree with those statements, or if there's something I'm missing here.
Well, I think it does take, it takes a special effort, and I would just use the word authenticity. Young people know immediately when someone is not being authentic. They are going to pick up on that within about the first move that you make, the first body language, the first words you say. So I don't ever try to pretend that I know, what youth have gone through or what their lives are, because I don't. I only know what my life is. And so there's respect in that. There's respect in me saying, I don't know what you're going through. I don't know what your life is like, but I do care about you, and I do care about, us having a relationship. And so where can we meet? There might be a big distance between us, but somewhere in there we can meet and take that forward. And, I have a lot of respect for teachers. I understand that teachers are being asked to do an awful lot of things in their days. And, you're being held accountable for a lot of different things. And sometimes relationship building is a lot of work and can take a lot of time. But I guess maybe what I would say is, at least for me in my work, the relationships that I've built with students, are why I go to work every day. They're my favorite thing. And so even though it's a lot of work and it's a lot of time, I get so much more out of those relationships than I give to them. I'm quite convinced of that.
And I feel extremely edified from our conversation. So thanks for coming on, and you are a wealth of knowledge. And from just the teacher perspective, I am glad to know that there are people like you, highly capable people out there, sort of working on that system side of things, but yet aware and experienced with the, sort of on ground level, making those individual connections with kids. So thanks for everything you do and for coming on the podcast.
Well, thank you, Joe. It's been a great talk. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you.
Thank you for listening. If you like what you hear, there are several ways you can support our work. First and foremost, You can subscribe to our podcast via iTunes Podcast, Google Play, Stitcher, SoundCloud, or just using our RSS feed. And giving us reviews helps more than you think. If you want to provide direct support, we have a support tab on our main page, we'redoingitwrong.com, that links to our Patreon account. Patreon's a neat system that allows you to pledge a dollar amount per episode produced and set a monthly maximum. So you only pay when you get new content you love. But most importantly, we just appreciate your listenership. Thank you.